the skull and crossbones, is the most famous pirate flag. But what if I told you that every pirate captain had a different flag, and each one carried a deadly message? What if I told you that these flags were so psychologically powerful that entire battles were won or lost before a single cannon was fired? Today, we're rediving deep into the dark waters of maritime history to decode the true meaning behind these terrifying symbols that struck fear into the hearts of sailors across the seven seas. Welcome back to the channel. I'm about to reveal secrets that Hollywood got completely wrong about pirate flags. The Jolly Roger isn't just a piece of cloth flapping in the wind. It is one of the most effective psychological weapons ever created. These flags weren't just symbols of rebellion or adventure like Pirates of the Caribbean wants you to believe. They were carefully crafted instruments of terror, designed to break the will of their enemies before a single shot was fired, save precious ammunition, and capture ships with their cargo completely intact. But here is the question that is going to change everything you thought you knew about pirates. Were pirate flags just symbols of maritime outlaws? Or were they weapons of psychological warfare so sophisticated that they could end battles without bloodshed, save lives on both sides, and generate more profit than any cannon or cutlass? By the end of this video, you'll see these iconic flags in a completely different light. And you'll understand why experienced sailors would rather surrender their entire cargo than face what these symbols promised would happen to them. The story begins in a time when the very concept of piracy was evolving from simple maritime robbery into something far more complex and terrifying. Let's start our journey in the early days of organized piracy, long before the Golden Age we know from movies and legends. Before the 17th century, pirates didn't use the skull and crossbones we're familiar with today. Instead, they flew blood-red flags or solid black banners. Crude but devastatingly effective symbols that communicated one simple, universal message that transcended language barriers. Death awaits you, and it's coming fast. The transformation from random sea robbery to organized, psychological warfare began in the Caribbean during the 1650s. European colonial powers were establishing massive trading networks, shipping incredible wealth across the Atlantic in vessels that were often poorly defended and completely vulnerable to attack. This created the perfect environment for a new kind of maritime criminal, one who understood that the right symbol could be more valuable than the sharpest sword. The term Jolly Roger itself is shrouded in mystery and competing theories, but most historians believe it comes from the French phrase Joli Rouge, meaning pretty red. This refers to those early blood-red flags that pirates would hoist when they were about to attack. But there is another theory that is equally fascinating. Some scholars believe Jolly Roger comes from Oli Raja, referring to Barbary corsairs from North Africa who operated in the Mediterranean centuries before Caribbean piracy began. These corsairs developed many of the psychological tactics that Caribbean pirates would later perfect. Imagine you're a merchant sailor in 1650, peacefully sailing across the Caribbean on a trading vessel loaded with sugar, tobacco, and silver. The sun is setting, painting the ocean crimson, when suddenly you see a ship approaching with a blood-red banner snapping in the wind. Your heart stops. You'd know immediately that your life was about to change forever, because every sailor in the Caribbean knew what a red flag meant. No quarter would be given if you chose to fight. These early flags served multiple purposes that went far beyond simple identification. First, they identified the vessel as a pirate ship. No confusion, no mistaking intentions, no possibility of claiming to be legitimate privateers or naval vessels. But more importantly, they were instruments of psychological warfare, that could end confrontations before they became violent. A pirate crew that could intimidate their victims into surrendering without a fight, saved ammunition, avoided casualties among their own ranks, could capture ships with their cargo intact, and could attack multiple targets in a single day instead of spending hours in bloody combat over each prize. Consider the difference between a pirate flag and a Royal Navy flag, and you'll understand the psychological impact immediately. When you saw the Union Jack, the French fleur-de-lis, or the Spanish cross, you knew you were facing representatives of a nation, bound by laws of war, codes of conduct, international treaties, and rules about treatment of prisoners. These flags represented civilization, order, legal authority, and predictable behavior. But when you saw a pirate flag, you knew you were facing men who had rejected society completely. Outlaws who lived by their own brutal code, answered to no king or country, and could do absolutely anything to you without facing any consequences. The evolution from simple colored flags to the complex symbols we recognize today happened gradually throughout the 17th and early 18th centuries. Driven by practical experience and deadly competition between pirate crews, pirates began to realize that specific imagery could be far more effective than just colors at communicating their deadliness, their ruthlessness, and their complete disregard for human life. What they created was a visual language of death that spoke to the deepest fears of every sailor on the ocean. Regardless of nationality, language, or cultural background, the development of this symbolic language wasn't random or accidental. Pirates were competing against each other for the most lucrative targets, and psychological warfare gave them a crucial advantage. A pirate crew that could capture ships through intimidation alone could operate more efficiently, attack more targets, and accumulate wealth faster than crews that had to fight for every prize. The flags became business tools as much as symbols of terror. Now let's decode the most important symbols that appeared on pirate flags, starting with the most famous one that everyone recognizes but few truly understand. The skull and crossbones. Simple, direct, and absolutely terrifying in its clarity. This symbol needs no translation in any language or culture. It means death is coming for you, specifically and personally. The skull represents the end of life, the termination of all hopes and dreams, while the crossbones beneath it form an X, marking the exact spot where your life will end if you do not comply with the pirate's demands immediately. But here's what most people do not realize about the skull and crossbones. It wasn't actually the most common pirate flag design during the golden age of piracy. It only became the standard representation of piracy in popular culture much later, after the actual age of piracy had ended and romanticized stories began to dominate public imagination. In reality, pirates used dozens of different symbols, each one carefully chosen to send specific psychological messages to their victims, communicate information about the pirate crew's reputation, and establish the captain's personal brand in the crowded Caribbean piracy market. The psychological impact of the skull and crossbones worked on multiple levels that modern marketing experts would recognize immediately. On the surface level, it represented death, universal, inevitable, and final. But on deeper psychological levels, it activated ancient human responses to mortality that bypass rational thought completely. When people see a skull, their brain immediately activates survival mechanisms that have been hardwired into human psychology for hundreds of thousands of years. The bloody flag, or solid red banner, was actually far more common than the skull and crossbones during the golden age of piracy, and it carried a much more specific and immediate threat. When pirates raised the red flag, They were making an absolutely clear statement that required no interpretation. No quarter will be given. This meant that if you chose to fight instead of surrender, every single person on your ship would be killed. No prisoners, no mercy, no second chances, no possibility of ransom or release. The red flag was essentially a death sentence with a brief opportunity for reprieve. Surrender now or die fighting, and die badly. The effectiveness of the red flag came from its absolute clarity and the reputation that successful pirates built around it. Many merchant captains would order immediate surrender the moment they saw a red flag, knowing that resistance meant certain death for their entire crew. This wasn't cowardice. It was practical survival based on reliable information about pirate behavior. Pirates who used red flags built reputations for keeping their promises. If they said they'd kill everyone who resisted, they followed through without exception. This reputation made the red flag incredibly effective, often ending confrontations before they began. The psychological cruelty of the red flag lay in its simplicity. There was no room for negotiation, no possibility of mercy, no hope for survival through clever bargaining or appeal to humanity. The red flag reduced complex human interactions to a single, brutal choice: surrender or die. This stark simplicity was psychologically overwhelming for merchant crews, who were used to thinking their way out of problems through negotiation and compromise. Pirates who flew red flags understood that their reputation for ruthless follow-through was their most valuable asset. A single act of mercy after raising the red flag could destroy years of carefully built psychological advantage. Future victims would think they could negotiate or fight successfully, leading to more resistance, more bloodshed, and less profit for the pirates. The red flag was a commitment device that forced pirates to be as ruthless as their reputation claimed. The hourglass was another devastating symbol that appeared on many pirate flags, and its psychological impact was particularly sophisticated and cruel. Unlike the skull and crossbones, which represented death in general terms, the hourglass represented time running out for you specifically. When you saw an hourglass on a pirate flag, the message was unmistakably clear. You have a limited amount of time to surrender before we attack, and once that time is up, your fate is sealed forever. Some historians believe pirates would actually give victims a specific amount of time, perhaps an hour, perhaps less, to decide their fate after raising the hourglass flag. The pirate ship would maintain its distance while the hourglass flag flew, giving the merchant crew time to debate their options, but making it clear that this time was finite and not renewable. Once the time expired, the pirates would attack without further warning or opportunity for surrender. The psychological impact of the hourglass was particularly cruel, because it forced victims to watch time slip away, knowing that each passing moment brought them closer to death or surrender. It turned waiting into torture, making the eventual decision to give up feel like a relief rather than a defeat. The hourglass created psychological pressure that built continuously until it became unbearable, breaking down resistance through sustained mental stress rather than immediate shock. Pirates who used hourglass symbols understood advanced principles of psychological manipulation that wouldn't be formally studied until centuries later. They knew that giving people time to think about their mortality actually increased fear rather than reducing it. The hourglass forced victims to imagine their own deaths repeatedly, while watching the symbol of their remaining time slowly running out. Perhaps the most chilling symbols were the skeletal figures holding weapons or drinking cups, which elevated pirate flag psychology to truly sophisticated levels of psychological warfare. These images showed death, not as a passive state or natural ending, but as an active, celebrating force that took personal pleasure in destruction. Picture a skeleton holding a cutlass in one bony hand and raising a wine cup in the other. This was unjust, threatening death. It was promising that death would enjoy killing you personally. The skeleton toasting your demise represented a complete inversion of normal human relationships with mortality. Instead of death being something that happened to you, the skeleton symbols suggested death was something that was done to you by an entity that took pleasure in the process. This psychological twist was particularly effective because it violated fundamental assumptions about death being impersonal or natural. Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard, flew one of the most psychologically sophisticated flags in pirate history, and studying his design reveals the advanced understanding of human psychology that the most successful pirates possessed. His flag showed a skeleton holding an hourglass in one hand and a spear pointing at a bleeding heart in the other. Every element of this design worked together to create maximum psychological impact through a carefully orchestrated narrative of doom. The skeleton represented death itself, but not passive death. This was death as an active agent with intentions and weapons. The hourglass meant your time was running out, creating temporal pressure that forced immediate decision-making. The spear showed death was armed and ready to strike, eliminating any possibility that death might be gentle or accidental. The bleeding heart promised that death would be neither quick nor painless, suggesting prolonged suffering for those who resisted. When merchant sailors saw Blackbeard's flag, they weren't just seeing a symbol of piracy. They were seeing a detailed preview of their own destruction, told through symbolic narrative. The flag told a complete story. Death has come for you personally. Your time is almost up, you will be pierced by weapons, and your heart will bleed out slowly. This was unjust intimidation. It was psychological torture through imagery that created a vivid mental experience of dying. The genius of Blackbeard's flag was that it combined universal symbols of death with specific promises about how that death would occur. The victim's imagination filled in the details, creating personalized terror that was far more effective than generic threats could ever be. Each person who saw the flag would imagine their own worst fears about dying, making the psychological impact unique to each individual while maintaining universal effectiveness. The bleeding heart became a popular symbol among pirates who wanted to communicate that they would show no mercy. But it carried additional psychological weight beyond simple threats of violence. Edward Lowe, one of the most sadistic pirates of the Golden Age, flew a red flag with a bleeding heart as his primary symbol. Lowe had a reputation for creative cruelty that made other pirates seem merciful by comparison, and his flag warned victims that surrender was their only hope of avoiding prolonged suffering. Lowe's use of the bleeding heart was particularly effective because hearts symbolize life, emotion, and humanity in cultures around the world. By showing the heart bleeding, Lowe's flag promised that he would attack not just your body, but your essential humanity. The bleeding heart suggested that Lowe took personal pleasure in causing emotional as well as physical pain, making him seem more dangerous than pirates, who were simply after money. The psychological impact of bleeding heart symbolism worked on multiple levels simultaneously. On the surface, it threatened physical violence and death. On a deeper level, it suggested that the pirate took personal pleasure in causing suffering, making them seem less human and more like forces of pure evil. On the deepest level, it activated fears about the violation of sacred human qualities like compassion and mercy. But pirates didn't just use generic symbols. Many of them created personalized flags that became their signatures across the Caribbean. building personal brands that were as recognizable as any modern corporate logo. These custom designs were like calling cards, letting victims know exactly which pirate crew they were facing, and what that meant for their survival chances based on that specific captain's reputation and preferred methods of operation. Calico Jack Rackham flew a flag showing a skull with 2 crossed cutlasses instead of crossbones, and this subtle change sent a very specific message about his preferred methods of operation. This design promised death by blade rather than by disease, accident, or cannon fire. The cutlass was the pirate's weapon of choice for close combat, and seeing crossed cutlasses on a flag meant you would face pirates in hand-to-hand fighting if you resisted. This was actually more terrifying than crossbones, because it promised a violent, personal death rather than a distant one. Calico Jack's flag also communicated information about his crew's fighting style and capabilities. Pirates who used cutlass symbolism were advertising their skill in close combat and their willingness to board enemy ships for hand-to-hand fighting. This required courage, physical skill, and complete commitment to violence that many pirate crews couldn't match. The crossed cutlasses were essentially a promise of superior fighting ability. The psychological impact of Calico Jack's flag was enhanced by his reputation for unusual cruelty and his association with female pirates, Anne Bonny and Mary Read. The combination of crossed cutlasses and stories about his crew's unconventional composition created a reputation for unpredictable violence that was particularly effective at intimidating traditional merchant sailors who had fixed ideas about how maritime combat should work. Bartholomew Roberts, known as Black Bart, was perhaps the most sophisticated pirate when it came to flag psychology and personal branding. He operated with multiple flags, each designed for different situations, different regions, and different types of targets. This level of strategic thinking about symbolic communication was unprecedented in pirate history and wouldn't be matched until modern advertising and marketing developed similar concepts. One of Black Bart's most famous flags showed himself standing on 2 skulls labeled ABH and AMH, a Barbadian S-head and a Martinican S-head. This wasn't just threatening death, it was threatening death with a personal touch, showing that Black Bart remembered his enemies and would hunt them down specifically. The flag communicated that Black Bart's violence wasn't random or impersonal, but targeted and vengeful. The psychological impact of this personalized threat was enormous. Most pirates threatened generic violence against anyone who opposed them, but Black Bart's flag promised specific vengeance against particular enemies. This made him seem more intelligent, more organized, and more dangerous than typical pirates who operated through simple intimidation. Merchants from Barbados and Martinique had special reason to fear Black Bart, but the flag's specificity made everyone wonder if they might be next on his personal hit list. Black Bart's other famous flag showed him standing alongside a skeleton, both figures holding an hourglass between them. This image was brilliant psychological warfare, because it showed cooperation between the living and the dead. The message was that Black Bart worked hand in hand with death itself, that he was death's partner rather than just its agent. When you saw this flag, you weren't just facing a pirate. You were facing someone who had made a pact with death itself. The imagery of cooperation between Black Bart and the skeleton suggested that death was not something that happened to Black Bart's enemies, but something that Black Bart and death did together as a team. This made Black Bart seem supernatural rather than merely dangerous, adding an element of cosmic horror to the practical threat of pirate attack. The shared hourglass suggested that Black Bart and death were timing their attacks together, coordinating the end of their victims' lives with supernatural precision. The personalization of pirate flags reached incredible levels of sophistication as the Golden Age progressed and competition between pirate crews intensified. Some pirates created flags that referenced specific events, threats, or promises that were meaningful to particular communities or regions. These were unrandom symbols thrown together for visual impact. They were carefully crafted psychological profiles designed to communicate exactly what kind of enemy you were facing and what you could expect from them. Henry Every, sometimes called the most successful pirate in history due to his capture of the Grand Mughal treasure ship, flew a flag showing a skull in profile wearing a bandana with crossbones beneath. The bandana was a direct reference to his personal appearance, making sure victims knew they were facing the famous Henry Every himself, not just any pirate crew. This personalization was crucial because Every's reputation preceded him. Ships would surrender immediately when they realized they were facing the king of pirates. Every's use of personal symbolism in his flag design showed sophisticated understanding of reputation management and personal branding. By making his flag immediately recognizable as his own, Every ensured that his legendary reputation for successful attacks would work in his favor during future encounters. Merchant ships that might have resisted an unknown pirate crew would surrender immediately when they realized they were facing Henry Every. The psychological impact of Every's personalized flag was amplified by stories about his incredible wealth and successful retirement from piracy. Unlike most pirates who died violently or in poverty, Every had successfully captured enough treasure to retire in comfort. This made his flag represent not just death and violence, but successful death and violence carried out by someone who had mastered the pirate trade completely. Thomas Tew used a flag showing an arm holding a cutlass emerging from clouds, and this symbol suggested that death could strike from anywhere, like lightning from a storm cloud. You couldn't predict where or when the attack would come, making every moment of sailing dangerous when Thomas Tew was known to be in the area. The arm emerging from clouds created an image of supernatural threat that transcended normal human limitations. The psychological brilliance of Tew's flag lay in its suggestion of omnipresence and unpredictability. While most pirate flags threatened what would happen if you encountered them, Tew's flag suggested that encounter was inevitable and could happen at any moment. The clouds implied that Tew could appear from any direction, attack without warning, and disappear just as mysteriously. This imagery of supernatural omnipresence made Tew seem more dangerous than pirates who operated through conventional intimidation. His flag suggested that he had transcended normal human limitations, and could strike like a force of nature rather than a human enemy. This psychological positioning made resistance seem futile and surrender seem like the only rational response. The most sophisticated pirates understood that their flags needed to work on multiple psychological levels simultaneously. They had to be immediately recognizable, instantly terrifying, culturally universal, and specific enough to communicate who was attacking and what would happen to those who resisted. These were unjust pictures on cloth. They were carefully designed instruments of psychological warfare that could end battles before they began. The visual design principles that pirates developed were remarkably sophisticated, considering that most pirates were illiterate and had no formal training in art or psychology. They intuitively understood concepts that wouldn't be formally studied until centuries later. The power of symbolic communication, the importance of brand recognition, the effectiveness of psychological warfare, and the value of reputation management in competitive markets. pirates discovered through trial and error that certain visual elements were more effective than others at creating immediate psychological impact. Skulls were universally recognized symbols of death that transcended cultural boundaries. Weapons suggested specific methods of violence that activated fear responses. Personal elements like clothing or distinctive features created memorable brand recognition. Time symbols, like hourglasses, created urgency that forced immediate decision-making. The evolution of pirate flag design represented a form of natural selection in symbolic communication. Flags that were effective at intimidating enemies were copied and refined by other pirates, while ineffective designs disappeared from use. This process created increasingly sophisticated symbols that combined maximum psychological impact with efficient communication of complex threats. But the true genius of pirate flag psychology lay in how these symbols affected behavior before any actual violence occurred. When a merchant ship spotted a pirate flag on the horizon, the captain had to make a series of rapid calculations under extreme psychological pressure. Could they outrun the pirate ship? Did they have enough weapons and crew to fight successfully? Was their cargo valuable enough to risk everyone's lives defending it? And most importantly, what did they know about this particular pirate's reputation for keeping prisoners alive? The psychological impact was immediate and overwhelming for crews who were not professional fighters. Merchant sailors were aren't warriors. They were tradesmen trying to make a living by transporting goods across the ocean. When faced with symbols promising creative death and prolonged suffering, their natural instinct was to preserve their lives rather than defend someone else's property. The flags activated survival instincts that overwhelmed rational calculation about odds of success or value of cargo. This psychological process happened within seconds of spotting a pirate flag, long before any actual confrontation began. The flag did most of the work of conquest, breaking down the enemy's will to fight through pure psychological pressure applied at exactly the right moment when victims were most vulnerable to intimidation. A ship that had been sailing peacefully suddenly found itself facing symbols of death and violence that demanded immediate life-or-death decisions. Consider the economics of this psychological warfare, and you'll understand why it was so revolutionary in maritime combat. Every battle that could be avoided through intimidation saved pirates ammunition, reduced the risk of casualties among their crew, preserved the cargo they were trying to capture, and allowed them to attack multiple targets in the same day instead of spending hours in combat over each prize. Pirates who built reputations for extreme violence found that their flags alone could clear entire shipping lanes. Merchant vessels would change course, delay voyages, or hire additional protection just to avoid areas where certain pirates were known to operate. This created a feedback loop where the most psychologically effective flags became more and more powerful over time as their reputations spread through the maritime community. The psychological impact extended far beyond individual encounters between pirate and merchant ships. Stories about pirate flags and what they meant spread through every port in the Caribbean and beyond, creating a shared cultural understanding of pirate symbolism that made the flags even more effective. Sailors would gather in taverns and share tales about different pirates and their flags, building a collective mythology around these symbols that enhanced their psychological power. By the time a merchant sailor actually encountered a pirate flag in person, he had probably heard dozens of stories about what that particular symbol meant, what had happened to other sailors who had seen it, and what the pirate captain was known for doing to prisoners. The flags became triggers for the entire cultural understanding of pirate violence, activating not just immediate fear, but accumulated terror from countless stories and legends. This shared knowledge made the flags devastatingly effective psychological weapons. A simple skull and crossbones was onto just threatening death. It was activating every story the viewer had ever heard about pirate cruelty. Every tale of ships found with all hands dead. Every rumor about torture and suffering. The flags became cultural artifacts that carried far more psychological weight than their simple imagery could create alone. The psychological warfare of pirate flags had an unintended consequence that would outlast piracy itself and transform these symbols into something much larger than their creators ever imagined. These symbols became so deeply embedded in maritime culture that they transcended their original purpose and became icons of rebellion against authority, in general, symbols that continue to influence human behavior. Centuries after the last pirate ship sailed the Caribbean, the Jolly Roger didn't die with the golden age of piracy. Instead, it evolved into something much more powerful, a universal symbol of defiance against established order that could be adapted to new contexts, while maintaining its essential psychological impact. During World War I and World War II, submarine crews began painting skull and crossbones on their vessels, borrowing the psychological power of pirate symbolism for modern warfare against legitimate military targets. The British Royal Navy, which had spent centuries hunting down pirates and hanging them in chains as examples to other potential criminals, began using variations of the Jolly Roger on their own submarines. Winston Churchill himself encouraged this practice, understanding that the psychological impact of pirate symbols could be just as effective in modern warfare as it had been in the Caribbean centuries earlier. This represented a complete transformation of pirate symbolism from criminal threat to legitimate military tool. American military units adopted similar practices during both World Wars, painting skull and crossbones on fighter planes, tanks, and ships. The symbol had evolved from representing outlaw pirates to representing elite military units that operated outside normal rules of engagement. The psychological message remained essentially the same. We are dangerous. We follow different rules than normal soldiers, and you should fear us more than conventional military forces. The adoption of pirate symbolism by legitimate military forces showed the enduring power of the psychological principles that pirates had discovered centuries earlier. Modern military commanders understood that symbols of death and rebellion could be just as effective at intimidating enemies in the 20th century as they had been in the 18th century, even when used by official government forces rather than criminal organizations. In civilian culture, the Jolly Roger became a symbol of personal rebellion against societal constraints and conventional behavior. Motorcycle clubs adopted pirate imagery to communicate their outsider status and rejection of mainstream social norms. Rock bands used skull and crossbones to signal their rebellion against commercial music industry standards. Fashion designers incorporated pirate symbols to appeal to consumers who wanted to express their rebellious side without actually breaking any laws. This cultural evolution shows the true genius of pirate flag psychology and its enduring relevance to human behavior. The symbols were so effective at communicating danger and rebellion that they continued to work long after the original context of Caribbean piracy had disappeared completely. A teenager wearing a skull and crossbones T-shirt in modern times is unconsciously tapping into the same psychological power that pirates used to terrify merchant sailors 3 centuries ago. The transformation of pirate symbols into mainstream cultural icons required the symbols to maintain their psychological impact, while losing their original association with actual criminal violence. This process shows how powerful symbols can transcend their origins and become part of permanent human cultural vocabulary. continuing to influence behavior and emotion across completely different historical periods and social contexts. The sporting world embraced pirate symbolism as a way to create aggressive team identities that would intimidate opponents and inspire fans. Football teams, like the Oakland Raiders, built their entire brand identity around pirate imagery. Understanding that fans wanted to associate with symbols of controlled violence and intimidation, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers literally named themselves after pirates, using that historical connection to create an aggressive team identity that would set them apart from other teams. The use of pirate symbolism in sports shows how these images continue to activate psychological responses related to tribal identity, group loyalty, and competitive aggression. Fans wearing pirate symbols are participating in the same psychological processes that made pirate flags effective weapons of war, just transferred to the context of athletic competition rather than maritime combat. Even in corporate culture, businesses began using subtle variations of pirate symbolism to communicate that they were disruptive forces in their industries who didn't follow conventional business practices. Tech companies adopted skull imagery to signal that they were killing outdated business models. Energy drink companies used pirate-inspired designs to appeal to consumers who saw themselves as rebels against conventional lifestyle choices. The corporate adoption of pirate symbolism represents the complete transformation of these images from criminal threats to marketing tools. But the underlying psychology remains the same. Companies use pirate symbols to suggest that they are dangerous to competitors, rebellious against industry norms, and attractive to consumers who want to associate with symbols of power and independence. The enduring power of these symbols reveals something fundamental about human psychology that has unchanged since the golden age of piracy. We respond to imagery of death and rebellion on a visceral level that transcends rational thought and cultural conditioning. When we see a skull and crossbones, part of our brain immediately activates ancient survival instincts, even when we consciously know there's no actual danger present. This explains why pirate flag symbolism remains effective in contexts that have nothing to do with maritime crime or actual violence. The symbols tap into psychological mechanisms that have unchanged since humans first developed the ability to recognize and respond to visual threats. We still fear death, we still respond to displays of power, and we still admire those who seem to operate outside normal social constraints. Modern psychology has given us scientific terms for what pirates understood intuitively. 3 centuries ago, through practical experience and deadly trial and error, they were using threat displays, behavioral patterns designed to communicate danger without actually engaging in violence. They were employing social signaling, using symbols to communicate complex information about group identity and capabilities. They were practicing psychological warfare, attempting to defeat enemies through mental pressure rather than physical force. But pirates weren't psychologists or military strategists in the modern academic sense. They were practical men who discovered through experience that the right symbols could be more effective than cannons and cutlasses at achieving their goals. Their flags evolved through a process of natural selection in symbolic communication. The designs that worked best at intimidating enemies were copied and refined by other pirates, while ineffective designs disappeared from use. The most successful pirates understood that their reputation was their most valuable weapon, more important than any physical tool or weapon they possessed. A pirate crew that could capture ships through intimidation alone could operate more efficiently and safely than crews that had to fight for every prize. The flags were investments in reputation. carefully crafted to enhance and maintain the psychological advantage that made profitable piracy possible. This brings us to perhaps the most important aspect of pirate flag psychology: the role of reputation management in maintaining long-term effectiveness. Pirates couldn't just design scary flags and expect them to work forever without backing up their threats with actual violence. They had to follow through on their promises often enough to maintain credibility, while being merciful enough to encourage future surrenders rather than desperate resistance. The most effective pirates struck a careful balance between violence and mercy that maximized their psychological advantage over time. They needed to be known for devastating violence against those who resisted, but also for showing mercy to those who surrendered quickly. This reputation encouraged future victims to choose surrender over resistance, making the flags self-fulfilling prophecies that created the conditions for their own success. Pirates who were too merciful found that their flags lost effectiveness over time as word spread that they were unlikely to follow through on their threats. Merchant crews would risk fighting if they knew the pirates were probably bluffing about extreme violence. Pirates who were too violent found that merchant crews would fight to the death rather than surrender, knowing they would be killed anyway regardless of their choice. The most successful pirates found the middle ground that maximized their psychological advantage by building reputations for being absolutely ruthless to those who resisted, but reasonably merciful to those who surrendered immediately. This balance required sophisticated understanding of human psychology and careful management of their reputation throughout the Caribbean maritime community. This balance required pirates to think like their victims, understanding what would make a merchant captain choose surrender over resistance in the crucial seconds after spotting a pirate flag. They had to consider not just immediate fear, but also long-term reputation management across the entire Caribbean trading community, where stories about pirate encounters spread rapidly through informal networks. The effectiveness of pirate flags also depended on the broader context of maritime law and international relations during the golden age of piracy. Pirates operated in a legal gray area, where merchant ships had limited protection from traditional naval forces. Colonial governments were focused on territorial expansion and trade regulation rather than maritime security, leaving merchant vessels largely defenseless against pirate attack. This vulnerability made psychological warfare more effective, because merchant crews knew they were truly on their own. When facing pirates, there was no possibility of rescue by naval forces, no hope of legal protection, and no expectation that pirates would be held accountable for their actions by any government authority. The flags worked because victims knew that pirates could follow through on their threats without facing any consequences. As colonial governments strengthened their navies and improved coordination against piracy in the later Golden Age, the effectiveness of pirate flags began to diminish. When merchant ships could expect naval protection or rescue, they were more willing to resist pirate attacks. The psychological warfare that had made piracy so successful became less effective as the broader strategic situation changed and pirates could no longer operate with complete impunity. The decline of piracy in the Caribbean marked the end of the original context that made pirate flags so psychologically powerful. But by that time, these symbols had already transcended their original purpose and become part of global cultural vocabulary. The skull and crossbones had evolved from a practical tool of maritime warfare into an eternal symbol of rebellion and danger that would continue influencing human behavior across completely different historical periods. Today, when we see pirate flags in movies, on clothing, in corporate logos, or in sports team imagery, we're re-witnessing the continuation of a psychological tradition that began in the lawless waters of the Caribbean centuries ago. These symbols continue to work because they tap into the same fundamental human responses that made them effective weapons of psychological warfare in the golden age of piracy. The legacy of pirate flag psychology teaches us something profound about the power of symbols in human communication and the persistence of certain psychological patterns across different historical periods. A well-designed symbol can transcend its original context and continue to influence behavior across centuries and cultures, maintaining its essential psychological impact even when its original purpose has been completely forgotten. Understanding the true history and psychology behind pirate flags gives us insight into how symbols acquire and maintain their power in human society across different contexts and time periods. These weren't just random designs chosen by illiterate criminals. They were sophisticated instruments of psychological warfare, created by practical men who understood human nature better than most scholars of their time. Developed through deadly trial and error in the most competitive environment imaginable. The pirates who sailed under these flags were outlaws and criminals. But they were also innovators in the field of psychological manipulation, who created techniques that continue to influence human behavior centuries later. They created a visual language that could communicate complex threats across cultural and linguistic barriers, using simple imagery to trigger fundamental human responses to danger and death that transcend rational thought. Their flags told complete stories in a single glance that could be understood by anyone regardless of education, language, or cultural background. Who was attacking? What would happen to those who resisted? What mercy might be available to those who surrendered quickly? And what the consequences would be for different choices? This wasn't just efficient communication, it was psychological warfare raised to the level of art. The next time you see a skull and crossbones anywhere in modern culture, remember that you're looking at one of the most successful symbols in human history, created by pirates as a practical tool for maritime robbery. It became a universal icon that continues to influence behavior and emotion centuries after the last pirate ship sailed the Caribbean. The symbol has survived the complete disappearance of its original context and continues to activate the same psychological responses that made it effective as a weapon of war. To the world, they were just flags flapping in the ocean breeze. To the sailors who saw them on the horizon, they were death itself, sailing closer with every passing moment, carrying promises of violence and suffering that could only be avoided through immediate surrender. The pirates who designed these flags understood something fundamental about human psychology that we're still learning to appreciate today. The right symbol, in the right context, can be more powerful than any weapon. The hidden meaning of pirate flags wasn't really hidden at all. It was communicated with brutal clarity through imagery that spoke to our deepest fears and most primitive survival instincts. These flags were never meant to be mysterious or subtle. They were designed to be immediately understood by anyone who saw them, communicating their deadly message across any language barrier or cultural difference in the most direct way possible. That is the true genius of pirate flag psychology. The creation of universal symbols that could terrorize victims and inspire followers across the diverse, multicultural world of Caribbean piracy. In an age before mass media or global communication, these flags became some of the most recognizable and psychologically powerful images in the world, known and feared from the Caribbean to the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, and they remain so today, proving that the most effective symbols are those that tap into the fundamental aspects of human nature that never change, no matter how much civilization advances around them. The skull and crossbones will always mean death and danger, just as it did when pirates first hoisted it above their ships in the lawless waters of the Golden Age. But there's one more layer to this story that reveals the ultimate sophistication of pirate flag psychology. The way these symbols created their own reality through the power of collective belief. Pirates didn't just use flags to communicate their intentions. They used them to shape the very nature of maritime reality in the Caribbean. When enough people believed that a particular flag meant certain death, that flag actually became capable of causing death through the psychological pressure it created. This phenomenon, where symbols become so powerful that they create the reality they represent, shows us something profound about the relationship between psychology and physical reality. Pirate flags worked because they convinced everyone involved that they would work. Merchants surrendered because they believed resistance was futile. Pirates became more confident and effective because they believed their flags made them invincible. The flags created a shared reality where psychological warfare was more effective than physical violence. The lasting impact of pirate flag psychology extends far beyond the historical period of Caribbean piracy. These symbols established principles of visual communication, brand recognition, and psychological manipulation that continue to influence everything from military strategy to corporate marketing to popular entertainment. Every skull and crossbones you see today is a descendant of those original pirate flags, carrying forward the same psychological DNA that made them effective weapons of war 3 centuries ago. The story of pirate flags is ultimately a story about the power of human creativity in the face of impossible odds. Pirates were outnumbered, outgunned, and hunted by every government in the world. They survived and thrived by developing psychological weapons that were more effective than any physical weapon their enemies possessed. They turned cloth and paint into instruments of terror that could end battles without bloodshed and generate wealth without traditional warfare. This creativity in the face of adversity shows us something important about human innovation and adaptation. When conventional approaches fail, humans have an extraordinary ability to develop new solutions that transcend the apparent limitations of their situation. Pirates couldn't match the firepower of naval vessels or the resources of colonial governments, but they could outthink their enemies in the realm of psychological warfare. The techniques that pirates developed for flag-based psychological warfare continue to influence modern conflicts, business competition, and social movements. Anytime someone uses symbolism to intimidate opponents, build group identity, or communicate complex messages quickly, they're using principles that were perfected by Caribbean pirates centuries ago. Understanding pirate flag psychology also helps us recognize these techniques when they're reused against us in modern contexts. Political movements, advertising campaigns, and social media manipulation all use variations of the psychological principles that made pirate flags so effective. Recognizing these patterns can help us respond more rationally to symbolic manipulation in our own lives. The enduring fascination with pirate flags reflects something deeper about human psychology, our simultaneous fear of and attraction to symbols of power and rebellion. We're drawn to pirate imagery because it represents freedom from social constraints, but we're also afraid of what that freedom might cost. Pirate flags embody this contradiction perfectly, combining symbols of death with promises of liberation. This psychological complexity explains why pirate symbolism continues to evolve and find new applications in different cultural contexts. The symbols are flexible enough to represent different things to different people, while maintaining their core psychological impact. A pirate flag can represent criminal rebellion, legitimate military service, sports team loyalty, corporate disruption. or personal style choice, all while activating the same fundamental psychological responses. The study of pirate flag psychology also reveals important truths about the nature of fear and courage in human behavior. Pirates succeeded not because they were braver than their opponents, but because they were better at managing fear, both their own fear and the fear of their enemies. Their flags were tools for fear management, designed to reduce their own anxiety, while maximizing their enemies' terror. This insight about fear management has applications far beyond historical piracy. Understanding how symbols can amplify or reduce fear can help us deal more effectively with modern sources of anxiety and intimidation, whether facing workplace bullies, social media harassment, or political manipulation. Recognizing the techniques of psychological warfare can help us respond more strategically. The evolution of pirate flags, from practical tools to cultural icons, shows us how symbols can outlive their creators and take on lives of their own. The pirates who designed these flags had no idea they were creating symbols that would still be recognizable and psychologically powerful centuries later. They were focused on immediate practical problems: how to capture ships efficiently and survive in a dangerous environment. This unintended longevity of pirate symbols demonstrates something important about human creativity and cultural transmission. The most powerful symbols are often created not by professional designers or marketers, but by people facing real-world problems who need to communicate effectively under extreme pressure. The urgency and authenticity of their situation creates symbols that resonate across time and culture. The global reach of pirate flag symbolism also shows us how effective visual communication can transcend cultural boundaries, more easily than language or written communication. A skull and crossbones means danger in every culture on Earth, while written warnings would require translation and cultural adaptation. Pirates accidentally created one of the first truly global visual languages. This universality of pirate symbolism has made these flags valuable tools for international communication in contexts ranging from maritime safety to environmental protection to medical warnings. The skull and crossbones appears on poison labels, dangerous chemical containers, and electrical hazard warnings because pirates proved that this symbol could communicate danger effectively to anyone, anywhere. The psychological principles behind pirate flag effectiveness continue to influence modern military doctrine and strategy. Military planners study historical examples of psychological warfare, including pirate tactics, to understand how symbols and intimidation can be used to achieve strategic objectives without conventional combat. The flags that pirates used to capture merchant ships have become case studies in military academies around the world. Modern terrorist organizations have also adapted pirate flag principles, using symbolic communication to amplify the psychological impact of their attacks and intimidate larger populations. Understanding how pirates used flags to create fear can help us recognize and respond more effectively to similar tactics used by modern threats. The commercial applications of pirate flag psychology extend into almost every area of modern business and marketing. Companies use variations of pirate symbolism to suggest that they're disruptive, rebellious, or dangerous to competitors. The psychological principles that made pirate flags effective weapons of war have been adapted to create effective tools of commerce and communication. But perhaps the most important lesson from pirate flag psychology is about the relationship between creativity and survival. Pirates faced seemingly impossible odds. They were vastly outnumbered by their enemies, lacked the resources of legitimate governments, and operated in a hostile legal environment where capture meant certain death. In this context, Psychological innovation wasn't just helpful, it was essential for survival. The flags they created represent human creativity at its most focused and effective. Every design element served a practical purpose. Every symbol was tested under real-world conditions where failure meant death. The result was a collection of visual designs that were so psychologically effective they continue to influence human behavior centuries after their original purpose disappeared. This connection between extreme pressure and creative innovation suggests that some of humanity's most effective solutions emerge from situations where conventional approaches have failed completely. Pirates couldn't succeed through normal methods of maritime warfare, so they invented new forms of psychological warfare that were more effective than anything that had come before. The legacy of pirate flag psychology reminds us that symbols matter, not just as cultural artifacts or artistic expressions, but as tools that can shape behavior, influence decisions, and change the course of human events. The flags that pirates created in the Caribbean 3 centuries ago continue to affect how we think, feel, and act in the modern world. Understanding this power of symbols helps us become more conscious consumers of visual information and more effective creators of symbolic communication. Whether we're designing logos, creating social media content, or choosing how to present ourselves to the world, we can learn from the pirates who proved that the right symbol, deployed at the right moment, can be more powerful than any traditional weapon. The story of pirate flags is ultimately a story about human ingenuity, psychological insight, and the enduring power of effective communication. Pirates took simple materials, cloth, paint, and creativity, and turned them into weapons that could end conflicts without bloodshed and generate wealth without traditional warfare. They created symbols that were so effective they transcended their original context and became permanent parts of human cultural vocabulary. These flags represent one of history's most successful examples of psychological warfare, developed not by trained military strategists or academic psychologists, but by practical outlaws who needed to solve immediate survival problems. Their success shows us that effective communication often emerges from necessity rather than theory, and that the most powerful symbols are created by people who understand human nature through direct experience rather than academic study. The next time you encounter any variation of pirate symbolism, whether on a sports team logo, a corporate brand, a warning sign, or a piece of clothing, remember that you're re-seeing the descendants of symbols that were once powerful enough to end battles and change the course of history. These images carry forward the psychological DNA of the original pirate flags, continuing to activate the same fundamental human responses that made them effective weapons of war in the golden age of piracy. The hidden meaning of pirate flags, as we've discovered, was never really hidden at all. It was communicated with deadly clarity through symbols designed to speak directly to the most basic human instincts of survival and fear. Pirates created a visual language that could transcend any cultural or linguistic barrier, delivering their message of death and terror to anyone who saw their flags approaching on the horizon. That's the true legacy of pirate flag psychology, the demonstration that human creativity, when focused by necessity and refined by experience, can create tools of communication so effective they outlast their creators by centuries and continue to influence behavior across completely different historical periods and social contexts. The skull and crossbones will always be more than just a symbol. It's a testament to human ingenuity in the face of impossible odds. A reminder that psychological warfare can be more effective than physical violence, and proof that the right idea, expressed through the right symbol, can become immortal. From the blood-red flags of early Caribbean pirates to the sophisticated psychological warfare of Blackbeard, Escalaton, and Hourglass. From Calico Jack's crossed cutlasses to Black Bart's personalized threats of vengeance, these symbols represent humanity's most successful experiment in visual communication and psychological manipulation. They worked then, and they continue to work now, because they speak to aspects of human nature that don't change with technology, culture, or time. We still fear death, we still respond to displays of power, and we still make split-second decisions based on symbolic information that bypasses our rational thinking processes. The pirates who created these flags understood something that we were still learning to appreciate. In the right context, with the right design, a simple symbol can be the most powerful weapon in the world. And that lesson, learned in the lawless waters of the Caribbean centuries ago, continues to shape our world today in ways we're only beginning to understand.